Chapter 3, Part 1. Ed and Helen Deepno lived in a small Cape Cod, chocolate brown, whipped cream trim, the kind of house which older women often call darling. 4 houses from the one Ralph and Bill shared. Carolyn had liked to say the Deepnos belonged to the Church of the Latter-day Yuppies, although her genuine liking for them had robbed the phrase of any real bite. They were laissez-faire vegetarians who considered both fish and dairy products okay. They had worked for Clinton in the last election, and the car in the driveway, not a Datsun now, but one of those new minivans, was wearing bumper stickers which said, "Split woods, not atoms," and "Fur on animals, not people." The Deepnos had also apparently kept every album they had ever purchased during the 60s. Carolyn had found this one of their most endearing characteristics, and now, as Ralph approached the Cape Cod with his hands curled into his fists at his sides, he heard Grace Slick wailing one of those old San Francisco anthems. "One pill makes you larger, and one pill makes you small, and the ones that mother gives you don't do anything at all. Go ask Alice when she's 10 feet tall." The music was coming from a boombox in the Cape Cod's postage stamp-sized porch. A sprinkler twirled on the lawn, making a hiss-a-hiss-a-hiss sound as it cast rainbows in the air and deposited a shiny wet patch on the sidewalk. Ed Deepno, shirtless, was sitting in a lawn chair to the left of the concrete wall with his legs crossed, looking up at the sky with the bemused expression of a man trying to decide if the cloud passing overhead looks more like a horse or a unicorn. One bare foot bopped up and down in time to the music. The book lying open and face down in his lap went perfectly with the music pouring from the boombox. Even Cowgirls Get the Blues by Tom Robbins. An all but perfect summer vignette, a scene of small-town serenity Norman Rockwell might have painted and then titled Afternoon Off. All you had to overlook was the blood on Ed's knuckles and the drop on the left lens of his round John Lennon specs. "Ralph, for God's sake, don't get into a fight with him!" Bill hissed as Ralph left the sidewalk and cut across the lawn. He walked through the lawn sprinkler's fine, cold spray almost without feeling it. Ed turned, saw him, and broke into a sunny grin. "Hey, Ralph," he said. "Good to see you, man!" In his mind's eye, Ralph saw himself reaching out and shoving Ed's chair, pushing him over and spilling him onto his lawn. He saw Ed's eyes widen with shock and surprise behind the lens of his glasses. This vision was so real he even saw the way the sun reflected on the face of Ed's watch as he tried to sit up. "Grab yourself a beer and drag up a rock," Ed was saying. "If you feel like a game of chess, beer." "A game of chess?" "Christ Jesus, Ed, what's wrong with you?" Ed didn't answer immediately, only looked at Ralph with an expression that was both frightening and infuriating. It was a mixture of amusement and shame, the look of a man who's getting ready to say, "Oh, shit, honey, did I forget to put out the trash again?" Ralph pointed down the hill, past Bill, who was standing. He would have been lurking if there had been something to lurk behind, near the wet patch the sprinkler had put on the sidewalk, watching them nervously. The first police car had been joined by a second, and Ralph could faintly hear the crackle of radio calls through the open windows. The crowd had gotten quite a bit bigger. "The police are there because of Helen," he said, telling himself not to shout. It would do no good to shout, and shouting anyway. "They're there because you beat up your wife. Is that getting through to you?" "Oh," Ed said, and rubbed his cheek ruefully. "That." "Yes, that," Ralph said. He now felt almost stupefied with rage. Ed peered past him at the police cars, at the crowd standing around the Red Apple, and then he saw Bill. "Bill!" he cried. Bill recoiled. Ed either didn't notice or pretended not to. "Hey, man, drag up a rock. Want a beer?" That was when Ralph knew he was going to hit Ed, break his stupid little round contact-lens spectacles, drive a splinter of glass into his eye maybe. He was going to do it. Nothing on earth could stop him from doing it, except at the last moment, something did. It was Carolyn's voice he heard inside his head most frequently these days, when he wasn't just muttering along to himself, that was. But this wasn't Carolyn's voice. As unlikely as it seemed, belonged to Trigger Vashon, whom he'd seen only once or twice since the day Trig had saved him from the thunderstorm, the day Carolyn had had her first seizure. "Hey, Ralph, be damn careful, you! This one crazy like a fox! Maybe he wants you to hit him!" Yes, he decided. Maybe that was just what Ed wanted. Why? Who knew? Maybe to muddy the waters up a little bit, maybe just because he was crazy. "Cut the shit," he said, dropping his voice to almost a whisper. He was gratified to see Ed's attention snap back to him in a hurry, and even more pleased to see Ed's pleasantly vague expression of rueful amusement disappear. It was replaced by a narrow, watchful expression. It was, Ralph thought, the look of a dangerous animal with its wind up. Ralph hunkered down so he could look directly at Ed. "Was it Susan Day?" he asked in the same soft voice. "Susan Day in the abortion business? Something about dead babies? Is that why you unloaded on Helen?" There was another question in his mind. Who are you really, Ed? But before he could ask it, Ed reached out, placed a hand in the center of Ralph's chest, and pushed. Ralph fell backward onto the damp grass, catching himself on his elbows and shoulders. He lay there with his feet flat on the ground and his knees up, watching as Ed suddenly sprang out of his lawn chair. "Ralph, don't mess with it!" Bill called from his place of relative safety on the sidewalk. Ralph paid no attention. He simply remained where he was, propped on his elbows and looking attentively up at Ed. He was still angry and afraid. But these emotions had begun to be overshadowed by a strange, chilly fascination. This was madness he was looking at. The genuine article. No comic book supervillain here, no Norman Bates, no Captain Ahab. It was just Ed Deepno, who worked down the coast at Hawking Labs. One of those eggheads, the old guys who played chess at the picnic area on the extension would have said. But still a nice enough fellow for a Democrat. Now the nice enough fellow had gone totally batshit. And it hadn't just happened this afternoon when Ed had seen his wife's name on a petition hanging from the community bulletin board in the shop at Save. Ralph now understood that Ed's madness was at least a year old, and that made him wonder what secrets Helen had been keeping behind her normal cheery behavior, demeanor, and sunny smile, and what small desperate signals, besides the bruises that was, he might have missed. And then there's Natalie, he thought. What's she seen? What's she experienced? Besides, of course, being carried across Harris Avenue in the Red Apple parking lot on her staggering, bleeding mother's hip. Ralph's arms broke out in goosebumps. Ed had begun to pace meanwhile, recrossing the cement path, trampling the zinnias Helen had planted along it as a border. He had returned to the Ed Ralph had encountered out by the airport the year before, right down to the fierce little pokes of the head and sharp jabbing glances at nothing. This is what the Gee Whiz was supposed to hide. This is what the Gee Whiz Act was supposed to hide, Ralph thought. He looks the same now as he did when he took after the guy driving the pickup truck, like a rooster protecting his little piece of the barnyard. None of this is strictly her fault, I admit that, Ed spoke rapidly, pounding his right fist into his open left palm as he walked through the cloud of spray thrown by the sprinkler. Ralph realized he could see every rib in Ed's chest. The man looked as if he hadn't had a decent meal in months. Still, once stupidity reaches a certain level, it becomes hard to live with, Ed went on. She's like the Magi, actually coming to King Herod for information. I mean, how dumb can you get? Where is he that is born king of the Jews? To Herod, they say this. I mean, wise men may ask. Right, Ralph? Ralph nodded. "Sure, Ed. Whatever you say, Ed." Ed returned to the nod and went on tramping back and forth through the spray and the ghostly interlocking rainbow, smacking his fist into his palm. "It's like that Rolling Stones song. Look at that, look at that, look at that stupid girl." "You probably don't remember that one, do you?" Ed laughed, a jagged little sound that made Ralph think of rats dancing on broken glass. Bill knelt beside him. "Let's get out of here," he muttered. Ralph shook his head, and when Ed swung back in their direction, Bill quickly got up and retreated to the sidewalk again. "She thought she could fool you, is that it?" Ralph asked. He was still lying on the lawn, propped up on his elbows. "She thought you wouldn't find out she signed the petition." Ed leapt over the walk, bent over Ralph, and shook his clenched fist over his head like the bad guy. Silent movie. "No, no, no, no!" he cried. The Jefferson airplane had been replaced by the animals, Eric Burden growling out the gospel according to John Lee Hooker. "Boom, boom, 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 gonna shoot you right down." McGovern uttered a thin cry, apparently thinking Ed meant to attack Ralph. But instead, Ed sank down with the knuckles of his left hand pressed into the grass, assuming the position of a sprinter who waits for the starter's gun to explode him out of the blocks. His face was covered with beads of what Ralph at first took for sweat, before remembering the way Ed had paced back and forth through the spray from the sprinkler. Ralph kept looking at the spot of blood on the left lens of Ed's glasses. It had smeared a little, and now the pupil of his left eye looked as if it had filled up with blood. "Finding out that she signed the petition was fate. Simple fate. Do you mean to tell me you don't see that? Don't insult my intelligence, Ralph. You may be getting on in years, but you're far from stupid. The thing is, I'd go down to the supermarket to buy baby food. How's that for irony? And find out she signed on with the baby killers? The Centurions? With the Crimson King himself? And do you know what? I just saw red." "The Crimson King, Ed? Who's he?" "Oh, please." Ed gave Ralph a cunning look. "Then Herod, when he saw that he was mocked, was exceedingly wroth, and sent forth, and slew all the children that were in Bethlehem and all the coast thereof, from 2 years old and under, according to the time which he had diligently inquired of the wise men." It's in the Bible, Ralph. The book of Matthew, chapter 2, verse 16. Do you doubt it? Do you have any fucking question that it says that? No, if you say so, I believe it. Ed nodded, his eyes a deep and sharp, startling shades of green. He darted here and there. Then he slowly leaned forward over Ralph, planting one hand on either side of Ralph's arms. It was as if he meant to kiss him. Ralph could smell sweat and some sort of aftershave that had almost completely faded away now into something else. Something that smelled like old curdled milk. He wondered if it might be the smell of Ed's madness. An ambulance was coming up Harris Avenue, running its flashers but not its siren. It turned into the Red Apple's parking lot. "You better," breathed into his face. "You just better believe it." His eyes stopped wandering and centered on Ralph's. "They're killing the babies wholesale," he said in a low voice which was not quite steady. "Ripping them from the wombs of their mothers and carrying them out of town in covered trucks. Flatbeds for the most part. Ask yourself this, Ralph. How many times a week do you see one of those big flatbeds tooling around down the road? A flatbed with a tarp stretched across the back. Ever ask yourself what those trucks were carrying? Ever wonder what was under most of those tarps?" Ed grinned. His eyes rolled. "They burn most of the fetuses over in Newport. The sign says landfill, but it's really a crematorium. They send some of them out of state, though, in trucks and light planes because fetal tissue is extremely valuable. I tell you that not just as a concerned citizen, Ralph, but as an employee of Hawking Laboratories, fetal tissue is more valuable than gold." He turned his head suddenly and stared at Bill McGovern, who had crept closer again in order to hear what Ed was saying. "Yea, more valuable than gold, and more precious than rubies," he screamed, and Bill leapt back, eyes widening in fear and dismay. "Do you know that, you old faggot?" "Yes," McGovern said. I guess I did." He shot a quick glance down the street when one of the police cars was not backing out of the Red Apple and turning in their direction. "Might have read it somewhere. In Scientific American, perhaps." "Scientific American!" Ed laughed with gentle contempt and rolled his eyes at Ralph again, as if to say, "You see what I have to deal with?" Then his face grew sober again. "Wholesale murder," he said, "just as in the time of Christ. Only now it's the murder of the unborn. Not just here, but all over the world. They've been slaughtering them by their thousands, Ralph, by their millions. Do you know why? Do you know why we've re-entered the court of the Crimson King in this new age of darkness?" Ralph knew. It wasn't that hard to put together. If you had enough pieces to work with, if you had seen Ed with his arm buried in a barrel of chemical fertilizer, fishing around for the dead babies he had been sure he would find. He sat up, half expecting Ed to shove him down again, almost hoping he would. His anger was coming back. It was surely wrong to critique a madman's delusional fantasies the way you might a play or a movie. Maybe even blasphemous. But Ralph found the idea that Helen had been beaten because of such hackneyed old shit as this infuriating. Ed didn't touch him. He merely got to his feet and dusted his hands off in businesslike fashion. He seemed to be cooling down again. Radio calls crackled louder as the police cruiser, which had backed out of the Red Apple's lot, now glided up to the curb. Ed looked at the cruiser, then looked back at Ralph, who was getting up himself. "You can mock, but it's true," he said quietly. "It's not King Herod, though. It's the Crimson King. Herod was merely one of his incarnations. The Crimson King jumps from body to body and generation to generation like a kid using stepping stones to cross a brook, Ralph, always looking for the Messiah. He's always missed him, but this time it could be different. Because Derry's different. All lines of force have begun to converge here. I know how difficult that is to believe, but it's true." The Crimson King, Ralph thought. "Oh, Helen, I'm so sorry. What a sad thing this is." Two men, one in uniform, one in street clothes, both presumably cops, got out of the police car and approached Bill. Behind them, down at the store, Ralph spotted two more men, these dressed in white pants and white short-sleeved shirts, coming out of the Red Apple. One had his arm around Helen, who was walking with the fragile care of a post-op patient. The other was holding Natalie. The paramedics helped Helen into the back of the ambulance. The one with the baby got in after her, while the other moved toward the driver's seat. What Ralph sensed in their movements was competency rather than urgency, and he thought that was good news for Helen. Maybe it hadn't hurt her too badly, this time at least. The plainclothes cop, burly, broad-shouldered, and wearing his blonde mustache and sideburns in a style Ralph thought of as early American singles bar, had approached McGovern, whom he seemed to recognize. Had approached Bill, whom he seemed to recognize. There was a big grin on the plainclothes cop's face. Ed put an arm over Ralph's shoulders and pulled him a few steps away from the men on the sidewalk. He also dropped his voice to a bare murmur. "Don't want them to hear us," he said. "I'm sure you don't. These creatures, centurions, servants of the Crimson King, will stop at nothing. They are relentless, I bet." Ralph glanced over his shoulder in time to see Bill point at Ed. The burly man nodded calmly. His hands were stuffed in the pockets of his chinos. He was still wearing a small, benign smile. "This isn't just about abortion." "Don't get that idea. Not anymore. They're taking the unborn from all kinds of mothers, not just the junkies and the whores. 8 days, 8 weeks, 8 months. It's all the same to the centurions. The harvest goes on day and night. The slaughter. I've seen the corpses of infants on roofs, Ralph, under hedges. They're in sewers, floating in the sewers. There's in the Kenduskag down in the barrens." His eyes huge and green, as bright as trumpery almonds, sailed off into the distance. "Ralph," he whispered, "sometimes the world is full of colors. I've seen them since he came and told me. But now all the colors are turning black." "Since who came and told you, Ed?" We'll talk about it later, Ed replied, speaking out of the corner of his mouth like a con in a prison movie. Under other circumstances, it would have been funny. A big game show host grinned on in his face, banishing the madness as convincingly as sunrise banishes night. The change was almost tropical in its suddenness, and creepy as hell, but Ralph found something comforting about it just the same. Perhaps he, McGovern, Lois, all the others on this little stretch of Harris Avenue who knew Ed, would not have to blame themselves too much for not seeing his madness sooner after all. Because Ed was good. Ed really had his act down. That grin was an Academy Award winner. Even in a bizarre situation like this, it practically demanded that you responded to it. Hey, he told the two cops. Mr. Burley had finished his conversation with Bill, and both of them were advancing across the lawn. Drop him a rock, you guys! Ed stepped around Ralph with his hand held out. The burly plainclothes cop shook it, still smiling a small, benign smile. Edward Deebno? He asked. Right. Ed shook his hands with the uniformed cop, who looked a trifle bemused, and then turned his attention to the burly man. I'm Detective Sergeant John Laydecker, the burly man said. This is Officer Chris Snell. Understand you had a little trouble here, sir. Well, yes, I guess that's right, a little trouble, or if you want to call a spade, I behaved like a horse's ass. Ed's embarrassed little chuckle was alarmingly normal. Ralph thought of all the charming psychopaths he'd seen in the movie. George Sanders had always been particularly good at that sort of role, and wondered if it was possible for a smart research chemist to know a small city detective who looked as if he had never completely outgrown into his Saturday Night Fever phrase. Ralph was terribly afraid it might be. Helen and I got into an argument about a petition she'd signed, Ed was saying, and one thing just led to another. Man, I just can't believe I hit her. He flapped his arms as if to convey how flustered he was, not to mention confused and ashamed. Laydecker smiled in return. Ralph's mind returned to the confrontation last summer between Ed and the man in the blue pickup. Ed had called the heavy-set man a murderer, had even stroked one across the face, and so the guy had ended up looking at Ed almost with respect. It had been like a kind of hypnosis, and Ralph thought he was seeing the same force at work here. Things just kind of got out of hand a little. Is that what you're telling me? Laydecker asked sympathetically. That's about the size of it. Yeah, Ed had to be at least 32, but his wide eyes and innocent expression made him look barely old enough to buy beer. Wait a minute, Ralph blurted. You can't believe him. He's nuts and dangerous. He just told me. This is Mr. Roberts, right? Laydecker asked Bill. John asked Bill, ignoring Ralph completely. Yes, Bill said, and to Ralph, he sounded insufferably pompous. That is Ralph Roberts. Laydecker last looked at Ralph. I'll want to speak to you in a couple of minutes, Mr. Robert, but for the time being, I'd like you to stand over there beside your friend and keep quiet. Okay, but, okay. Angrier than ever, Ralph stalked over to where McGovern was standing. This did not seem to upset Don in the least. He turned to Cress. You want to turn off the music, Cress, so we can hear ourselves think? Yo! The uniformed cop went to the boombox, inspected the various knobs and switches, then killed the Who halfway through the song about the blind pinball wizard. I guess I did have it cranked a little. Ed looked sheepish. Wonder the neighbors didn't complain. Oh well, life goes on, John said. He tilted a small, serene smile up toward the clouds drifting up across the blue summer sky. Wonderful, Ralph thought. This guy is a regular Will Rogers. Ed, however, was nodding as if the detective had produced not just a single pearl of wisdom, but a whole string of them. John rummaged in his pocket and came out with a little tube of toothpicks. He offered them to Ed, who declined, then shook one out and stuck it in the corner of his mouth. So, he said, little family argument, is that what I'm hearing? Ed nodded eagerly. He was still smiling his sincere, slightly puzzled smile. More of a discussion, actually, a political Laydecker said, nodding and smiling. But before you go any further, Mr. Deepno, Ed, please. Before we go any further, Mr. Deepno, I just kind of want to tell you that anything you say could be used against you, in a court of law. Also that you have a right to an attorney. Ed's friendly but puzzled smile, gosh, what did I do? Can you help me figure it out? Faltered for a moment. The narrow, appraising look replaced it. Ralph glanced at McGovern, and the relief he saw in Bill's eyes mirrored what he was feeling himself. Laydecker was John was maybe not such a hick after all. What in God's name would I want an attorney for? Ed asked. He made a half-turn and tried the puzzled smile out on Chris, who was still standing beside the boombox on the porch. I don't know, and maybe you don't, Leidecker said. Still smiling. I'm just telling you that you can have one, and that if you can't afford one, the city of Derry will provide you with one. But I don't. Leidecker was nodding and smiling. That's okay, sure, whatever. But those are your rights. Do you understand your rights as I've explained them to you, Mr. Deepno? Ed stood stock still for a moment, his eyes suddenly wide and blank again. To Ralph, he looked like a human computer trying to process a huge and complicated wad of input. Then the fact that the snow job wasn't working seemed to get through to him. His shoulders sagged. The blankness was replaced by a look of unhappiness too real to doubt. But Ralph doubted it anyway. He had to doubt it. He had seen the madness on Ed's face before John and Chris arrived. So had Bill. Yet doubt was not quite the same as disbelief, and Ralph had an idea that on some level Ed honestly regretted beating Helen up. Yes, he thought, just as on some level he honestly believes that these Centurions of his are driving truckloads of fetuses out to the Newport landfill, and that the forces of good and evil are gathering in Derry to play out some drama that's going on in his mind. Call it Omen 5 in the Court of the Crimson King. Still, he could not help feeling a reluctant sympathy for Ed Deepno, who had visited Carolyn faithfully 3 times a year during her final confinement at Derry home, who had always brought flowers and always kissed her on the cheek when he left. He continued giving her that kiss even when the smell of death had begun to surround her, and Carolyn had never failed to clasp his hand and give him a smile of gratitude. Thank you for remembering that I'm still a human being, that smile had said, and thank you for treating me like one. That was the elf Ralph had thought of as his friend thought. Or maybe only hoped that Ed was still in there. I'm in trouble, aren't I? He asked John softly. Well, let's see, John said, still smiling. You knocked out 2 of your wife's teeth. Looks like you fractured your cheekbone. I bet you my grandfather's watch she's got a concussion. Plus selected short subjects, cuts, bruises, and the funny bare patch over her right temple. What'd you try to do, snatch her bald-headed? Ed was silent, his green eyes fixed on John's face. She's going to spend the night in the hospital under observation because some asshole pounded the hell out of her, and everybody seems in agreement that the asshole was you, Mr. Deepno. I look at the blood in your hands and the blood in your glasses, and I gotta say I also think it was probably you. So what do you think? You look like a bright guy. Do you think you're in trouble? I'm very sorry I hit her, Ed said. I didn't mean to. Uh-huh. And if I had a quarter for every time I've heard that, I'd never have to buy another drink out of my paycheck. I'm arresting you on a charge of second-degree assault, Mr. Deepno, also known as domestic assault. This charge falls under Maine's domestic violence law. I'd like you to confirm once more that I've informed you of your rights. Yes. Ed spoke in a small, unhappy voice. The smile, puzzled or otherwise, was gone. Yes, you did. We're going to take you down to the police station and book you, John said. Following that, you can make a phone call and arrange bail. Chris, put him in the car, would you? Chris approached Ed. You going to be a problem, Mr. Deepno? No, Ed said in that same small voice. And Ralph saw a tear slip from Ed's right eye. He wiped it away absently with the heel of his hand. No problem. Great! Chris said heartily and walked him to the cruiser. Ed glanced at Ralph as he crossed the sidewalk. I'm sorry, old boy, he said, then got into the back of the car. Before John closed the door, Ralph saw there was no handle on the inside of it.